Take the Amazon, the river with the most water on Earth. A staggering share of all the river water on this planet drains into the ocean through this single river. But here's the thing that should really make you stop and think. Why didn't a single pyramid, a single Colosseum, or any great ancient civilization ever rise up along the banks of this massive river? Now flip it around and look at the Nile. It's tiny compared to the Amazon, and it's surrounded by nothing but desert. And yet this one thin ribbon of water fed a single civilization for thousands of years. Doesn't that strike you as strange? It means a big river with tons of water isn't what builds a civilization. So what's the real formula? Today's video, we're going to break down one by one the 5 conditions that make a great river, the conditions that quite literally shaped the fate of humanity. And at the end, we'll check how the rivers that we Americans deal with every single day stack up against these same criteria on the world geopolitical stage. There are literally thousands of officially named river systems around the world, but not all of them provided an environment that favored human settlement and development. Some rivers served as the cradle for massive civilizations, while others acted as giant geographic barriers that blocked humanity's expansion. As we already mentioned, the Amazon ranks at the very top of the world in terms of water volume and sheer scale, but it never produced a state-level civilization the way the Nile did. The Nile, on the other hand, sits smack in the middle of a desert, and yet it sustained a civilization along a single river system for thousands of years. That gap doesn't come down to a river's raw physical size or how much water it carries. There's a separate set of conditions that actually determine whether a river contributes to human survival and nation building. Let's break that answer down into 5 geopolitical criteria. The first condition is directly tied to a natural phenomenon that modern society usually files under disaster. The first condition is predictable flooding. To modern people, a flooding river means evacuation alerts and flood warnings. It's filed away as a natural disaster. But throughout human history, flooding was actually the key ingredient that gave birth to entire state systems. What matters here isn't how massive the flood was, it's how consistent the cycle was. The ideal flood hit at the same time every single year, and the water rose gradually rather than all at once. As the water slowly rose and then receded, it left behind a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt. That was nature's own mechanism for turning barren land into fertile farmland. In other words, this kind of flooding wasn't an uncontrollable disaster. It was just one part of a massive natural cycle built for agricultural production. Being able to predict the timing of the flood from year to year meant farmers could actually plan their planting seasons systematically. That's what allowed people to settle down permanently, and the resulting food surplus became the foundation on which states and institutions were built. On this front, the Nile is the textbook example. Once the summer monsoon hit the Ethiopian highlands, the Nile's water level rose in the exact same pattern year after year. For ancient Egypt, this flood wasn't a disaster, it was a data point the central government tracked and controlled. The government used these statistics to forecast harvests, set tax rates, and plan how tribute would be distributed. The Indus River and China's Yellow River offered a comparatively shakier deal. The timing of their floods was somewhat predictable, but the sheer volume of water was overwhelming. Facing floodwaters powerful enough to blow out levees, farmers had to walk a tightrope between fertile soil and the constant risk of catastrophic flood damage. There's a Chinese legend about a man who became king simply because he successfully brought a great flood under control. And that alone tells you that in this region, mastering water management was basically synonymous with the right to rule. The harshest environment of all belonged to the Tigris and Euphrates River basin. Flooding there was wildly erratic. Brutal droughts and sudden, everything-destroying floods took turns hitting the region. In an environment where you could never predict what the water would do next, flooding wasn't a helpful farming tool, it was a constant, lethal threat you always had to brace for. The second condition is slow currents, meanders, and floodplains. Fast-flowing rivers tend to run in more or less a straight line. When the terrain drops sharply and the current moves fast, there simply isn't enough time for silt to settle. That accelerates erosion along the banks and structurally limits how much farmland can expand. That setup might be great for shipping goods quickly, but it's a poor environment for a large-scale agricultural civilization to take root. Now, flip that around. When a river's current slows, the whole geopolitical equation flips with it. A slow-moving river doesn't run straight. It naturally winds and curves, forming what we call meanders. As a river meanders, the outer bank gets eroded away while sediment builds up along the inner bank. Repeat that process over a long stretch of time, and the river's path keeps shifting, carving out a wide, flat depositional landscape. That landscape is the floodplain, and it's the real cradle of every great civilization. Floodplain soil is rich, and because a fresh layer of organic material gets deposited with every flood, farmers could start large-scale planting almost the moment the water receded. Human civilization wasn't built on the surface of the water. It was built on top of these massive floodplains that river systems carved out over time. You see this same pattern repeated at just about every major cradle of civilization on Earth. Thanks to its gentle current and the well-developed meanders in its lower reaches, the Nile managed to carve out a huge agricultural belt right in the middle of the desert. For us Americans, the most familiar example of this geopolitical pattern is the Mississippi River. The Mississippi used that same combination, a slow current and a massive floodplain, to create an enormous stretch of farmland right through the heart of North America. All those oxbow lakes scattered across the Mississippi Basin today are clear geological proof of the river shifting its course over and over through meandering. You see the exact same mechanism at work with the Po River in northern Italy. The Po carved out a huge floodplain in that region, and that floodplain became the foundation for what is now Italy's breadbasket, the Po Valley. The third condition is year-round flow. Most rivers on Earth don't flow at a steady rate all year long. Water volume spikes during the rainy season, but during the dry season, some rivers run bone dry or dry up completely. For regions that depend on rivers like that, irrigation ends up hostage to unpredictable rainfall instead of a dependable water source. The more the water supply swings, the more a community's farmland and harvest yields swing right along with it year to year, and that makes any kind of long-term national planning basically impossible. The rivers that gave rise to great civilizations, on the other hand, all kept a steady flow year-round. Even during a drought, when rainfall dropped off, these rivers never fully dried up. They always held on to at least a baseline flow. That stability had a direct impact on the entire national economy and daily life. It meant a reliable drinking water supply, large-scale irrigation systems that kept running non-stop, and a river transport network that stayed open no matter the season. The Nile checks this box perfectly, too. Its water level rose and fell seasonally, sure, but even in the worst droughts, the main channel never actually cut off. The same goes for the Yangtze River in East Asia. Despite being directly exposed to the Asian monsoon, the Yangtze's massive drainage basin and diverse water sources kept it flowing generously all year round. That's what let it support a massive population while also enabling stable inland shipping and agriculture, the foundation that propped up a series of huge empires. The Indus, by contrast, had such an extreme gap between its wet and dry season flow that farmers had to gamble with serious risk every single year. The Tigris and Euphrates were even harsher. Irrigation-based farming in that region was less a system and more a bet. People were staking their survival on an environment they had zero control over. The three conditions we just covered are the baseline requirements for any truly great river: predictable flooding, slow currents with floodplains, and year-round flow. Those objective criteria alone are enough to knock the vast majority of the world's river systems out of the running as potential centers of civilization. But even if a river's water supply is predictable, fertile, and never runs dry, a civilization still ends up geographically isolated if there's no physical network of waterways connecting it to the outside world. So the fourth condition is navigability. Before the era of modern highway networks, inland waterways were by far the most efficient way to move cargo. Moving the same weight of goods by boat saved a staggering amount of money and labor compared to hauling it over land. That's why the rivers that raised up historical civilizations weren't just water sources. They functioned as massive national infrastructure, moving both people and goods. And here, the key metric isn't just whether ships can sail on the river, it's whether that navigability is continuous. If a river is only navigable in certain isolated stretches, its economic impact is extremely limited. The waterway has to run unbroken from upstream all the way down to the mouth for the logistics network to actually function. If there's a massive waterfall or a set of violent rapids blocking the middle of the river, the whole system falls apart. Instead of one giant artery, you end up with a bunch of disconnected fragments. And that seriously undercuts the river's ability to knit the entire basin into a single unified economy. Very few rivers in the world check this box, and among them, the Nile has an especially rare geographic edge. The Nile system has very few waterfalls or rapids, and its overall gradient is remarkably gentle. On top of that, while the river itself flows from south to north, the trade winds over the Mediterranean blow from north to south. That meant ships could ride the current going downstream, then simply raise a sail and let the wind carry them back upstream. It was one of the only places on Earth where two-way river travel worked perfectly without any mechanical power at all. And this is exactly where the Mississippi flexes its geopolitical muscle again. The Mississippi doesn't get that same lucky wind pattern the Nile does, but it makes up for it with an enormous web-like network of tributaries that stay deep enough to navigate. That made the entire system perfectly suited for moving huge amounts of cargo by steamboat basin-wide. Thanks to the single massive logistics network, the United States was able to knit together an incredibly powerful domestic market almost immediately after the country was founded. Major tributaries like the Missouri and the Ohio connected into the system like capillaries, letting large ships push deep into the interior of the North American continent. On the flip side, there are plenty of geopolitical examples of rivers with plenty of water that never got to expand their infrastructure because their navigability was broken up. The Congo is one of the biggest rivers on Earth by volume, but a chain of rapids and waterfalls in its lower stretch cuts off its logistics network entirely. The Mekong has the same problem. Rapids show up at multiple points along its course, which puts a hard geographic ceiling on tying the whole river basin into one unified economy. The fifth condition is geopolitical openness of the surrounding terrain. No matter how perfect a river's hydrology is, if the land around it is closed off, that river has almost no shot at becoming a geopolitical power center. Picture a river boxed in by steep cliffs and canyons. There's barely any flat land behind it to convert into farmland, which puts a hard cap on how big a settlement and how dense a population can get. Rugged terrain like that also jacks up the cost of moving goods and connecting with other regions. In an isolated setup like that, a river ends up being little more than a drinking water source, nowhere near enough to build a continent-scale integrated economic system. Now picture the opposite, a river running through a vast, open plain. That's a completely different geopolitical story. When the land is flat, farmland naturally expands outward, and big commercial cities spring up on top of that fertile floodplain. As people and capital pile up, that river system becomes the strategic backbone tying the whole region together. And the final piece that completes this openness is a physical connection to the ocean. Once a river's mouth opens out to the sea, all that surplus production and those resources from the interior can finally reach global markets. A river with a wide estuary that large cargo ships can actually sail into and out of acts as a direct bridge, linking the continental interior straight to global trade networks. Only once that ocean access is locked in can a nation move beyond simple self-sufficiency and enter an era of international trade, accumulating wealth and extending its influence abroad. Historically, the great rivers that built massive empires and economic blocs, the Nile, the Mississippi, the Yangtze, all share the same geographic openness. And again, a river's true value as national infrastructure was never just about its raw length or its water volume. What actually matters far more is how vast a geopolitical hinterland that river system commands, and how powerfully it connects to the outside world through the ocean. We've now broken down all 5 objective criteria that define a truly great river. So with those metrics in hand, let's rank the world's rivers by how much they've actually contributed to human civilization and national economies. The number 1 river system, backed up by the historical record, is Africa's Nile. Predictable flooding, year-round water supply, gentle meandering terrain, massive floodplain farmland, two-way navigability, and open ocean access via the Mediterranean. The Nile is truly one of a kind, a river that, without any human engineering at all, checked off nearly every box required for civilization in its natural state. Coming in at number 2 is America's own Mississippi River. If you're judging purely on natural conditions by early agricultural society standards, the Mississippi actually loses out to the Nile. But the Mississippi has something no other river system on any other continent can match: overwhelming network connectivity. The Mississippi isn't just a single main channel, it's a massive waterway network that stitches together a huge chunk of the North American continent like a spider web. On top of that, modern technology got layered in: steamboats, levee and dredging infrastructure, and connections to freight rail networks. The result is that the Mississippi evolved into arguably the most powerful, most efficient inland logistics system in human history. Since the founding of the United States, it's tied the whole continent into a single domestic market, functioning as the single most powerful piece of geopolitical infrastructure behind the rise of a modern industrial superpower. Coming in at a very close number 3 are India's Ganges and China's Yellow River. Thanks to its massive alluvial plains, gentle current, and abundant water supply, the Ganges has historically supported one of the highest population densities on Earth. The Yellow River also offers a top-tier ecosystem when it comes to the agricultural fertility of its sediment. But both of these river systems come bundled with brutally destructive flooding, and the sheer difficulty of managing that water at a national scale is a serious built-in geographic liability. The 5 river conditions we've broken down have historically acted as the fork in the road that decided the geopolitical fate of entire continents. Every continent had rivers, but depending on the physical characteristics of each river system, civilization organized itself in completely different ways. First, Africa. African river systems rank among the highest in the world for water volume. Massive river networks like the Congo and the Niger exist, but they were blocked by waterfalls, rapids, and rugged canyons, making them unsuitable for inland shipping or large-scale farming. In that harsh terrain, the Nile was the only major river system that was actually usable. With the Nile hoarding every geographic advantage in one narrow corridor, ancient African civilization concentrated its national power and population there, producing a uniquely singular empire-based ecosystem. Second, Asia. Asian civilizations developed through the process of physically taming rivers that were abundant but brutally hard to control. Asia's rivers generally have massive drainage basins, which meant they had the agricultural potential to support enormous populations from very early on. But river systems like the Yellow River, the Indus, the Tigris, and the Euphrates all caused massive loss of life through uncontrollable flooding. To bring these dangerous water systems under control, Asian societies developed highly centralized political organization and advanced flood control engineering early on. The result was a diversified landscape of civilization, with multiple ancient states, each with a distinct geopolitical identity tied to its own river basin, growing and competing side by side. Third, Europe. Rivers like the Rhine, the Danube, and the Seine, along with the Po, the backbone of northern Italy's breadbasket, all contributed to core economic networks and city formation. But the geopolitical weak point of Europe's river systems was their fragmented scale. Each river system's drainage basin was relatively small, and Europe's rugged inland mountain ranges and watersheds constantly cut the connections between waterway networks. So, European rivers were effective at knitting together local, regional economies, but they fell short of becoming a single, continent-spanning political backbone. European powers made up for what their rivers couldn't deliver in terms of logistics integration by pioneering ocean-based networks instead. They used their long coastlines and excellent ocean access to connect ports around the Mediterranean and the North Sea by the shortest possible routes. The fact that European nations bonded with each other through sea routes rather than through inland rivers became the fundamental geographic driver behind their later expansion into global maritime empires. And finally, fourth, the Americas. North America turned out to be a nearly perfect environment, geopolitically speaking, for building a massive economic power built on rivers. The Mississippi, in particular, is the textbook example of river infrastructure, a vast floodplain hinterland, outstanding soil fertility, and absolute continuity of navigation. Large-scale population density and serious development based on this massive ecosystem kicked off much later here than it did across Eurasia. But once steam-powered cargo ships and continent-spanning rail infrastructure mechanically merged with the Mississippi River system during modernization, the result was explosive economic growth. The Mississippi isn't a symbol of an ancient agricultural civilization, it's the symbol of a river system that helped complete a powerful modern industrial nation. Latin America also has an extensive lineup of rivers with tremendous potential: the Amazon, the Orinoco, the Paraná, and the Magdalena. If large-scale population density and organized flood control infrastructure had taken root along these basins thousands of years earlier, the geographic potential was absolutely there for a massive civilization to rise up. The 5 core conditions we've broken down so far were all geological and natural specs of a river system. But in modern geopolitics, a completely new, man-made constraint has emerged that determines how valuable a river network really is. That constraint is national borders. In the face of this political variable, even a river system with a flawless geographic profile can't escape structural risk. One of the rivers most directly tied to the daily infrastructure of us Americans, the Colorado River in the West, sits right at the center of this crisis. The Colorado originates in the Rocky Mountains, cuts through 7 U.S. states, and then crosses the border into Mexican territory. The drinking water for major metro areas like Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Phoenix, along with the irrigation water that sustains massive industrial farmland in California and Arizona, all depend entirely on this single river system. But years of accumulated drought driven by climate shifts, combined with an explosive rise in upstream water usage, have driven the major downstream reservoirs down to record low water levels. Right now, in this very moment, fierce disputes are playing out between upstream and downstream U.S. state governments over how to divide an extremely limited water allocation, on top of ongoing multilateral diplomatic negotiations with the Mexican government south of the border. The fact that a single massive river system gets carved up and subordinated across multiple state governments and sovereign national jurisdictions, that's the single most serious geopolitical vulnerability facing modern river infrastructure. And this kind of water security threat isn't confined to the U.S. mainland either. There's a sharp military and diplomatic standoff brewing between Ethiopia, which is building a massive dam at the Nile's upstream source, and Egypt, which is trying to defend its survival downstream. There's also an ongoing national security dispute between China, which controls the dam releases on the upper Mekong, and the Southeast Asian countries downstream, which are getting hit hard with severe drought as a direct result. No matter how much water volume or how much fertile terrain a river has going for it, if control over its uppermost reaches sits in the hands of a foreign government, that river becomes a fatal security variable, capable of shaking a nation's very existence. At the end of the day, in modern geopolitics, a river's true potential isn't defined by natural conditions alone. Which government can control that vast river network and how stably and exclusively they can control it has become the key measure of national power. Even so, every conversation about a nation's geographic infrastructure always circles back to the same 5 fundamental conditions we broke down today: how controllable the flood cycle is, how much farmland the surrounding hinterland can support, how unbroken the cargo transport network stays, and whether there's a physical link to global trade routes. It was never just a river's length or its water volume. It's these massive geopolitical factors that have decided the fate of empires. I hope this video gave you a fresh, objective look at just how much geopolitical value is packed into the massive river infrastructure running through the American continent. Here on Professor Room, we'll be back with an even deeper dive into world geography and strategic analysis in our next video. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a like to help the channel keep growing. Thanks for watching.